Hello, Tess. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Arts House. I'm Erin from Ethos Books, and a warm welcome to the launch of Brown Is Redacted, Reflecting on Race in Singapore. So this book launch is also part of the Singapore Writers' Festival, organised by the Arts House Limited and commissioned by National Arts Council. Before we begin the session, please be reminded that all beeping devices should be put on silent or turned off as a courtesy to the speakers and your fellow audience members, and videography and flash photography are not allowed. So we'll have a conversation with our speakers, followed by an audience Q&A. If you have any burning questions throughout the session, please scan the QR code on the screen behind us. It will show up later on. You can scan the QR codes with your phones and you'll land on Slido, where you can leave questions for the panelists and upvote questions you want answered. And you can also go to slido.com/brownisredacted to send your questions. We'll also be doing live notes, which you can access with the QR code as well. There it is. It's together with Yen, who is calling in from the US, who very cleverly put it in his background. So now I will introduce our speakers. We have Kristian-Marc James Paul. He's an activist and writer, and he's a member of Climate Justice Collective, SG Climate Rally. Apart from his work in climate activism, Kristian also facilitates intergroup dialogues, partnering with organizations like AWARE to run community discussions on masculinity and male allyship. He was also a contributing author for White, Behind Mental Health Stigma, an anthology on mental health in Singapore. Next, we have Laika Jumabhoy. She has a background in psychology and has worked the last 4.5 years supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence in Malaysia and Singapore, and most recently as a senior case manager at AWARE. She is passionate about the use of expressive arts in trauma recovery and is the co-founder of So Let Us Talk, a peer-led expressive arts support group that provides a safe space for survivors of sexual and domestic violence to come together and support each other. And she's currently pursuing her master's in clinical psychology and raising a little one. Next we have Mysara Aljaru. She's a lens-based practitioner, writer, and researcher. Mysara was previously a journalist and a documentary producer, and has also worked with various research institutions. An artist and writer herself, Mysara has showcased and performed at Objectives, the Substation, Art Science Museum, and Singapore Art Week 2022. Next we have Myle, who is on the screen. He's a writer, director, and actor. His works have appeared in Panel by Panel, New Narrative, and The Bungalow Review, and he is associate artist with Checkpoint Theatre. And lastly, we have our moderator, Paul M. Jerusalem. He is a second-generation Filipino writer, creative, and researcher. Born in Singapore, his writing dwells on what it means to be in the spaces between. He is interested in issues of race, diaspora, transnational identity, gender, and sexuality. And without further ado, I'll pass the time to Paul to begin the session.
All right, thanks so much, Erin, for the lovely introductions of all 5 of us. So I'm aware that, because of how this room is set up, things feel very strangely you can hear a pin drop if no one's talking. So it feels like there's a bit of anticipation, of course, but also some because this is a panel, right, it feels kind of formal-ish, and it doesn't help that a couple of us are wearing jackets, kind of, but I think for this session, just, all of us are talking as friends, all of us are talking as people who have a lot in common, have many different specificities to our experiences, and brownness as a label, as a category. Different people have said different things about the concept of brownness, but we gather here today being united by, this overarching concept of, brownness as something that has been useful in our writing, in our work, in helping us to understand not just ourselves, but also the people around us in our communities and people that we interact with. So I'm not going to go too deep into that to give everyone more time for their thoughts, but this is definitely something that we'll return to later. Just a show of hands, how many of you have actually watched Brown Is Haram last year at Sepfest? Just a show of hands. Okay, so it's not a lot, and that's great, because here our focus will be on the book Brown Is Redacted, and of course there are connections to the play, but for today's talk we really want to focus it on this book as a standalone text, which does contain the script, but also many other different texts that have been contributed by other people as well. All right, so the first question, this is for Chris and Mysara again. So some of us here, less than a quarter actually, have watched the play Brown Is Haram. And Nabila's essay in the book tells us more about the name, right, which is a riff playing on the phrase Dada Itu Haram, which refers to the tagline behind an anti-drug campaign targeting the Malay community to tell them drugs are haram. Of course, it couldn't have existed in another language, right, for some reason. But we are here to talk about the book at hand, and it's quite interesting that instead of retaining the same name as the performance lecture that you have crafted, you've decided to go with Brown Is Redacted. So tell us more about your thought process behind this.
Yeah, so I think I'll start off by, I guess, giving like 2 points as to why we decided to change the name. I think first of all, Brown Is Haram, the performance lecture was something very special between me, Mysara, and then eventually Yen also. And I think we wanted to kind of, sort of like maintain the sanctity of the performance lecture, which was I think very, very special, given that I think it was a very particular moment of us sort of sharing our vulnerabilities with each other, sharing our stories. And so that's why I think we wanted to also then show, the second reason is that we also wanted to show that this was just an evolution of the performance lecture. It was more than just our voices. The performance lecture, like I said, was really just our 3 stories, and we wanted to convey that with Brown Is Redacted, it is really not our stories. It's an anthology of different voices, and the aim of the anthology was to expand the narratives, to expand, I guess, the stories that could be told. Second thing I would say is that I guess when we were thinking about a new title, when we had decided that we were going to change the title, we were deciding, when we were trying to decide the title, we kept asking ourselves, like, I guess, kind of like, what were we trying to say about brownness, or what was the anthology trying to say about brownness? And I think the thing that we kept coming back to is, I guess that, and we articulate this in the introduction also, is that there's a sense of like intangibility, you can't really touch it, you can't really hold on to it. But beyond that also, I guess, a sense of hiddenness, right, that sort of quote unquote like true brownness or like authentic brownness is oftentimes hidden or curtailed in Singapore, where the trope of the model minority, I guess, is so overwhelming, and so that's why we went with something like Redacted, to sort of convey that hiddenness.
Thanks for that, Chris. Yen and Mysara, any additions to that? Yen? So in addition to what Chris said, so 2 points, 2 overarching points. First of all, maintaining the sanctity of the performance lecture, right? As we call the book a standalone text, and to name it the same thing would be to suggest that it is merely that. But you've talked about how it's an evolution from that, an expansion from just the performance lecture, right? So renaming it is important to signal that the 2 are connected but separate things. And second of all, what we are trying to say about brownness, right? You talk about the intangibility of brownness, how difficult it is to pin down, as well as the concept that for some people there exists a true brownness, right? What do we even consider true brownness? And this is something that the performance lecture captures, as well as the other works in the collection. So in addition to that, Yen and Mysara, anything? If not, we can move on to the next question, which is kind of related to this. So I mean, when you use the word redacted, right, it's not an accident for sure. When you say redacted, what I think about most, like, what comes up at the top of my mind as someone who's like terminally online is the fact that redacted is kind of like a meme among social media circles, particularly on Twitter, when people try to have plausible deniability, right, and they want to say something about something else, right, that might be considered as critical, right, they would replace the entity that they're talking about and say, blah, 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 redacted, blah, blah, blah. And there's a cheekiness to it, a playfulness to it that it's often used in a very ironic way, which I think that kind of irony is kind of captured in the performance lecture. With regard to redacted, why Brown is redacted and not simply Brown is erased or Brown has ceased to exist?
I think there's a lot of reasons for it, partly because, when you use the word redacted, there's this implication that like certain narratives are forced to be erased, right? This is what we're trying to also implement and highlight, right? There are certain tropes, or narratives about us minority people that we see often in mainstream media, right? And there's another, other narratives are hidden, right? When you talk about minorities, the first thing you think about would be Malay or Indian, right? What about, our migrant workers, so Filipinos or Indonesians, we often forget about them. They're not there. But they're not, we don't think about them because, these narratives are not often, brought up by state media, for example, right? You have to be actively talking to people in the community to understand what they're going through. So I think that's one reason. Also, with this idea, again, going back to this model minority, how we view minority is what essentially, is an extension of what we understand as this Singapore identity, right? To be a minority, you need to be either very successful, right? Like what I wrote in my part of the play, you have to get an NUS law degree or whatever. Or you go to the other extreme where, you live in a one room flat, you have 5 kids at the age of 23 or something like that, right? It's either extremes, right? Which is not actually the lived realities, I was telling Paul, whenever I write, I think of Minas on Twitter and what they say. You know my name but not my story. But they have a point, right? You look at someone, you think of them you think of a stereotype, right? You don't bother asking them about, what it's really like, to live their lives, right? So we make assumptions, we make stereotypes. So, Minas have a point on Twitter, you know their name but you don't know their stories. Yeah.
I love that point you raised about how, because of the myth of the model minority, right? Minority race people are expected to either be exceptional, right? If not a cautionary tale to warn the rest of the community. Okay, if you don't do this, then you'll become just like the rest of us. It's a very reductive kind of tale, and I think what you say about this notion of true brownness and the perfect model minority, I think that leads me to something that really captivated me about your work. It opens with this poetic sequence where it talks about something along the lines of "Don't go into the sun, you are brown enough." And something that struck me about that was the fact that usually the word enough is used to affirm people, saying I am enough, I don't have to meet certain standards. But in this poetic sequence, it was almost a kind of you're brown enough, so don't go and enjoy yourself in the sun, blah, 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 things like that, right? So with regard to your work, something I really loved was how it touched on intergenerational racial connections and relationships. The person who talked about being brown enough was someone from, the older generation, right, who has a very close connection to you. In particular, your work, I think, troubles one tempting narrative of racism as being something that necessarily comes from the oppressor solely, right? Fleshing out the way that it is sometimes or often enforced by the very ones who raise us. And sometimes it's not done in a conscious way, sometimes it's subconscious. But I think in your work, you really trouble this narrative and show how even something that's supposed to be affirmative usually is sometimes used to draw the boundary between being acceptably brown and too brown. So with regard to your piece, what were your hopes with this piece, Beauty in Me?
I think you've kind of pointed out some of the hopes already in that I particularly chose words that should in theory be very easy to interpret, and like you said, enough is almost always seen as affirmative, but in using this kind of language I wanted to bring up the confusion actually that a lot of us feel when we are growing up in terms of what is acceptable and what is not, and really to highlight that it isn't always, in your face comments or things that are really obvious to you, but it is done through grandparents saying things and then parents just going like, yeah, okay, it's so what, right? And then it just kind of perpetuates over the generations, and it leaves you in this kind of confused space. I wanted to bring up that tension because in some occasions you're told to be like, tie your hair really tight, like go to school, don't really let all those, don't let too many curls out. And some occasions like Diwali or something, they're like, come on, show all your curly hair, like wear all those bangles, speak properly. So I think in using that kind of language, it is to really bring up the everyday confusion that sometimes you don't realize until much later as well.
That was beautiful. Thank you for that, Laika. And for those of you who are here just to see whether you want to end up spending money on the book, if this doesn't tempt you, I don't know what will. But it ends up with this very beautiful excerpt that I just want to read out because it returns to the notion of being enough and turns it into something beautiful again and reclaims the term from something that was used intergenerationally as a source of, I want to say trauma, but maybe hurt or pain in general, right? So here I read, so this is talking about the speaker's daughter. My heart warms as she proudly proclaims, I am fiery, jam-tart warrior princess. I am caught off guard at a self-assured assertion. I am beautiful, don't want clips or hair tie, silencing any attempts to tame her calls. As she grows, I pray this fire does too, anchoring her from retreating into herself as she faces question after question. Gazing at her tiny fingers clasped around one of my crutches as we head out to play, I hope that she sees that there is beauty in her and me. I am afraid, yet I am sure we will be enough. So we're talking about intergenerational racial politics and trauma. Here, something very powerful that you do is you really show how you break that cycle. And it's not something that's easy, but it's something that comes from the natural perception or natural beauty that stems from the younger generation who hasn't yet been exposed to as much of the external forces that try to quell our brownness. So I really love that. Thank you for that. Okay, so back to Yen and Chris and Mysara, and I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience regarding this as well. But in terms of curating a collection of writing, right, all of you had a very close hand in inviting people to be a part of this, in putting out a call for submissions. The process of curating this is very different from writing a performance lecture, I'm sure. So what were some lessons that you learned during the process of writing or curating this? And how did this differ from the process of writing Brown Is Haram? So Yen, I think we haven't really heard from you, so I'm going to arrow you right now.
Okay, sure. Hi everyone. I'm currently looming. I find it too funny to not bring it up. Okay, anyway. On curating slash working with the performance, I actually found editing the work was very similar to directing the production in terms of like the internal motivation, the principles that we were operating on. Because in both senses, for the book and the play, what I was trying to do as editor or director is to make sure that the people who are generously sharing these stories are getting the spotlight. and that there's as few barriers between the person reading or watching and the story they're hearing. And just sharing that moment together. With the production, what we were trying to do was we wanted to make like a comfortable physical space, a space that felt honest and vulnerable and real. And the goal, one of the goals with the book was to try and recreate that sensation, but in a more abstract way. I think executing that took a different set of tools than what we would do on the stage. One of the biggest things for that with the book was the sequence. We spent a lot of time debating about what the order of the text should be, what should come first, what should come after which. You can pick up the book and you can just open up any chapter and read it and you'll be fine. And you'll enjoy that, what you're reading. But we also wanted to try and create this sort of through line, this narrative that people could follow, feel the mood shift with people's words. But part of that was thinking about also how to section the book, because the book is split up into 4 different sections, which was very difficult because these experiences aren't really like neatly sectioned. We can't be like, oh, these are all about this, and these are all about this. So that was operating more on instinct.
Thank you, Ian. So you mentioned how directing the play was actually not too dissimilar from curating the book. How about for the ones who, Chris and Mysara, you really poured forth all the very real and visceral experiences that you have from your entire life history, and some of them I really related to them very much. In working with people beyond just yourselves, were there any interesting lessons or different, things about the experience?
I think for me, the biggest tension or the biggest thing that I kept coming back to, the question that I kept asking myself, which was also something that I shared last week in the panel that we also did with Ethos, was I guess negotiating between trying to edit a work and not, I guess, gatekeeping or curtailing someone's art and how they express art, especially for something that is so visceral, that is so material, that is tied very much to what they've experienced. How do you acknowledge that and honor that while still, I guess, sort of having your editor hat on and thinking about where does this go in the book? Can this be heightened or amplified in a certain way to bring out a specific sentiment or emotion? So I guess that for me at least was something that I took away, just sort of, there's this delicate balance that I think, I don't have any answers for right now. It's still something that I think about. But just thinking about the negotiation between amplifying someone's art and also then the more technical, slightly more utilitarian things that go into the act of editing and the process of editing.
And I think it's alright that you don't really have all the answers right now, because I think these thoughts will form as people read the book and come up to you and of course thank you for the work, but also tell you about how it evoked certain emotions or sentiments in them. Similar to after the performance lecture, I remember standing outside and just pouring forth everything I felt about it to you guys. So later on there'll be a chance for that to happen as well for those who've read it. That brings us to our last question just for the panel, which is, okay, we are going into the difficult stuff now. So obviously it's to do with brownness, right? A common charge by people who are not big fans of the conceptual term brownness, assuming that they oppose this concept for reasons other than racism or a resistance to progressive or anti-racist politics, is that the term flattens the multifaceted experiences that non-Chinese and non-white people in this part of the world have. So in other words, the term, according to these people, group together the experiences of Malay people with those of Indian people, as well as those of middle-class minority race people with those of the working class, right? Or even more glaringly, as Mysara mentioned earlier, those whose existence in this country is predicated by their enforced marginal status in the form of a work permit. Since, for those who are unaware, a work permit dictates that you're here in Singapore for a duration of time. There is no pathway to citizenship under the work permit, right? And even if you were to somehow fall in love with someone who's a local, you need to get your employer's permission in order to be able to marry that person. And this is something that I learned in one of the essays here by home, so excellent choice there. But bringing us back to the question, how have you decided to embrace brown as a concept in spite of these charges that have been brought forward?
I think as in the introduction, Chris and I have acknowledged the limitations with the term brown, but also I think, this idea of shared experiences, right? Like, when you go to like work, for example, right? And maybe there's only one Malay, one Indian person and your colleague starts speaking in Chinese and then you exchange that look with your brown colleague. You know that look, right? The expression of it. Right? It's those moments where you have that little bit of solidarity, that we also wanted to like, bring about. But also I think, we also, I think when we did that play also, we recognized that, both of us have very different experiences. Laika have very different experiences. And this is, but how do we talk about it, but at the same time also acknowledge it, right? So for me, at least, brown is like a term of acknowledgement that, hey, even though we might have different class backgrounds, but there is something that we share, right? Living as minorities in this country, and I guess that's how I see it, Yeah.
So brownness as something that unites these shared experiences. How about Chris, Laika, Yan?
I think quite similar to Mysara. For me, I think about using, obviously many terms have problems with it, and you can go and pick out all the problems, but when I think about using the term, I think about a sense of belonging, which is I think particularly important in spaces where you many times don't feel like you belong at all. So being able to use a common term, and even as you said, like have those glances and just have little bits of commonalities, even though there might be very many differences, is I think very, very important. And similarly, using a common term also allows you to highlight which are differences you want to, right? So your brownness is different to mine, and it's okay. And it can be highlighted in different ways. So I think that's the uniqueness of using a common term in that way.
And the term is not just common, but straightforward enough.
Yeah.
Like no one will hear the word brown and be like, huh? What does brown mean? It's obvious that you're talking about a particular group of people, even if the exact definition of what that group is a bit more open to interpretation. Chris, Yan, any thoughts on the use of brownness as a conceptual term or category?
Yeah, I guess it's, for me, the question is what is the point in categorization and what does that do? I think brown as a category to me is about as helpful as CMIO. It subsumes, it ends up like swallowing up people's individual experiences, and that's part of the project with this book, is to take out the individual story and make that the centerpiece rather than the collective categorization that you could slap onto any person.
So I think something that both Laika and Yan have talked about is how, and Mysara hints at this as well, but like use the term not as a limiting kind of category, but something that opens up not just conversations but also other ways of thinking, right? So, yeah.
If I can add on, of course, like one critic people would say, oh, it's a concept that you take from the West, I guess my personal response would be, you're not listening to us. You're not listening to us. You're not understanding what we're trying to say, right? You're focusing on terms, right? I guess at some point all of us would be online and we see this whole debate about whether we should use the term Chinese privilege, but no one was discussing about the issue behind it, right? Or the experiences or structural issues. It's a form of distraction, essentially. Sure, we can talk about it, and I think we should talk about it, right? But, whether I guess brown people should be talking about it, right? Can we form a new term or should we stick to this term? But generally, right, if your focus is on like, oh, you guys are taking this from the West, but not actually engaging in in the discourse, then I think it's a distraction rather than an attempt to like tackle the issue.
Exactly, that's a great point. The term brownness, while our endeavor is to use it to open up other ways of thinking, being able to be vigilant against attempts to, reduce it to a scapegoat, right? To distract people from the issue at hand, right? This awareness and this vigilance against such actors is very important as well. And I think I kind of see this book, right, as a kind of textbook, like the textbook that we never had. And even the metaphor of textbook isn't great because like textbook, is something that we kind of memorize in school. But I mean textbook in a way that for many of us brown people who never really had a collection of stories by people like us growing up, this helps to open up our eyes to things that we've gone through but never really had the language to talk about. And it's not just academic kind of writing, right? Not just academic essays. It centers also people's very real lived experiences, and that's something I really love about it, right? So any other comments to that before we open up our Q&A session? All right, if not, okay, so we have around 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you scan the QR code here, you would be able to put in some questions. And let me just refresh the link on my phone. Oh, and we've got the questions right here as well. Okay, so we're just taking a moment to look at the questions, and I think there's one here by Megan. Okay, 3 here by Megan, yes. Very, very productive question asker. During Q&As, I tend to just be engrossed in like what everyone is saying and like scramble for questions at the end. So let's go with the most highly voted question first. Race and any accompanying tensions have always been sensitive topics in Singapore. Did the team face any issues with censorship? If no, can say no. It's okay, right?
But I, like in terms of like, no, we can't write this. No, like we've never like experienced that. Yeah.
So in other words, this very ambitious project has been accompanied by an editorial team as well as a publication that is very supportive of narratives that might not be in line with the OB markers, so-called. Next question, sorry Megan, I'm gonna move on to someone else first. Okay, so this is something that we kind of touched on, but there's something slightly different to it. So Wycott asks, some feel that brown is a reductive term because it incorporates tropes of colorism that are foreign to Singapore discourses about quote-unquote race. In addition to what Wycott asked, I also want to bring up what Chris said earlier about, or was it Ian, about CMIO being as useful as brownness, right, in terms of how reductive and limiting it can be. So what do all of you feel about brown being seen as a reductive term?
I guess something that we try to say in the book also is that like, right, this anthology is merely just like one thing, and that there are many stories that we definitely could not incorporate or did not incorporate. And I remember us, at least the three of us, definitely having conversations about colorism, right? And that also being, I think, a form of privilege also, right? How can you navigate the world if you look a certain way as opposed to another way? And how can then you survive this world because your skin is of a lighter color for sure. So that's definitely something that we talked about. I guess that's the only thing I would really add to this question. I know that wasn't really answering the question, but
What's that?
Honestly, I don't think that it's that foreign. Maybe our parents, our grandparents didn't use the word brown, but I think they would talk about the same things we experience in some sense. You know, maybe it's foreign because we have social media now and everyone is speaking about it publicly. But I think this is very important to note that discourse and conversations about race is not new, it's not foreign. You know, it might seem new and foreign to you because you've never had to face it. You never had that discussion with your parents, right? You know, you've never had your dad coming back home and like, yeah, you know, like I'm the only Malay man in the Bible, you know, in the office. You never had that. So it may seem foreign because at that time there was no Twitter. Right, RIP Twitter, I don't know where this discourse will go next, but yeah.
I mean, something that just came to mind about CMIO being compared to brownness, right, is the fact that CMIO itself is that not a Western import, right? Like it stems from this categorization of race from the colonial administration that somehow we've retained and had no problem embracing despite its roots. So I think it's not necessarily an unproductive question to ask about whether you're simply blindly adopting something that came from Western cultural discourse. But in asking that question, also pay attention to other discourses that were imported. And so what if something was imported, right? Or so what if something was influenced by thinking in another part of the world? If it's useful, we make it our own, right? Not just blindly adopt it wholesale. If it's not useful, then obviously we wouldn't adopt it, right? So next question. Okay, so there's this question from Arun, which talks about Hazira Muhammad's essay, right? Where so it's all about racialized health framing and how so the piece critiques reductive explanations of unequal health outcomes amongst minority race people's challenges, and it explores the dominant state narratives as well as addresses how this has been internalized by minorities. So what do you think would be, okay, I'm going to edit the question a bit to make it broader to the book. So in addition to what Arun asks about the next step in addressing this, how do you also see this book as having a role in looking at this narrative from the state as well as other racialized dominant ideas about race? Yeah, we're all looking at you.
Wait, what was the question?
Yeah, it was a very long question.
What was the question? What does this book say about race?
Oh, how? Obviously listening. Okay, no, but I also ramble a bit. So it's the question by Arun. The TLDR of my question, right, is how does this book relate or play a part in looking at the dominant state narratives? And is it supposed to play any role vis-a-vis these dominant state narratives? The question by Arun was, what do you think is the next step in addressing this? But I'm also just adding on to relate it to the book.
Yeah, it's kind of a big question. I did hear it. I was listening, Paul. I think the point. I think the way I view the book is it's meant, even though there are a lot of great academic pieces in there, it's in a way anti-statistic. It's not meant to be an encyclopedia. It's meant to be a catalog of people's experiences, and some of those fall under these state narratives or defy those state narratives. But I think it's more about looking at people, which I think it's not the inclination of a governing body.
Right, so this book being anti-statistics and letting the stories not only speak for themselves, but also even trouble the notion that everything that is statistical is necessarily what should be seen as the unchallenged truth. Right, these individual stories, even if statistically they are not experienced by 70% of people, they still matter. Returning to Arun's question, right, so the reason why I edited the question a bit is the fact that Hazira is not on this panel, so I don't know if anyone would be able to answer this, but the question Arun asked was, what do you think would be a next step in addressing these dominant state narratives that have been internalized by minorities?
I think a nice first step would be just, even within your friends and family, right? Especially if you're Malay, you're from Retarian, the first thing you see is diabetes, right? And recently they roped in the Indian community as well, right? So, and of course, if you don't understand, not everyone has access to data and statistics, right? So we tend to just take it wholesale. But now that you read what Hajar wrote, you have a more critical understanding of how the state uses numbers, right? Data. Bring it up to your friends and your family. Say hey, this is not everything or whatever this report has. It's not a complete understanding of issues in our community, right? Issues of, for example, health often ties, I think Hajar brought up to issues of class, access to healthcare, right? That is often on purpose, I would say, not brought in when we talk about health in brown communities, in minority communities. So I think that's the first step. Of course, I'm not going to tell you guys to go to panels and then start scolding the ministers, no. But, you can, I'm not going to stop you, but don't take it from me. But just even among ourselves, right? Have that thought that we have, our friends have, our family have. I think if we want to talk about racism, with the majority, first, you have to do the work, within ourselves, a bit cliche, but, break the internalized racism that I guess at some point all of us had, right? And then once you're able to understand that, then, you're able to, I guess, articulate that thought to your wider circles. Yeah, I guess that's my suggestion.
So having these conversations, these difficult conversations with other people, but most importantly with yourself, right? Being honest to your experiences and doing them justice by really tackling these, aspects of your history which you might have subdued over time, and thinking about, oh, wait a minute, that was actually pretty messed up. Why did that happen to me, right? So that's always the first step to being able to have these trivial conversations with other people. So there are many, many questions. I'm sorry that we are not going to be able to ask all of them. Later on at the signing, anyone here who has not had their question answered, please do feel free to do that. I think for our last question for now, I'm going to ask one of Megan's questions, which I thought was a nice note to end on. So her question is, when putting the anthology together, how did the team try to strike or find the balance between hope and despondency that comes with the Brown experience? So, many of these experiences that are slightly more negative, but how did you also balance that with a note of hope, right? Looking towards something more optimistic.
Yeah, I think for us it was always important that when speaking about brownness, that we were not just talking about brown trauma, brown negative experiences, but that we had stories of hope, of liberation, I guess, in it, and I think that was very important. That was definitely something that when Mysara and I were first writing the performance lecture, Alfian Sa'ad was our dramaturg, and he kept asking what are the moments of tenderness, what are the moments of sort of solidarity that sometimes you can't necessarily articulate, but you just feel so viscerally, and those were the things that we then also wanted to put into the book, and that's why I guess you have these stories of self-actualization, of feeling powerful, of feeling like you have agency, because that is important, if not more important than the critiquing, right? The celebrating is what we try and convey.
Yen, any further comments to that?
No, I think Chris was exactly on the nose with that. I think when we were asking people, and this was a big part of what we wanted from the non-academic pieces as well, because the academic pieces, unfortunately, veer towards a more difficult place, because that is the hard facts of it. But I think we were also looking for the moments of community, of joy, of connection, whatever those could be, and how that can all flow together and not make a book. We didn't really want to make a book that people finish and go, oh, well, That's too bad. We wanted to make a book that can make people feel something, you know, just feel there's ups, there's downs, it's life.
That's really deep. Yes, Mysara.
I think to add on, like, I'm going to read like the last paragraph of one of my favorite pieces when we did the open call for that under 18 by Ashwin Ram Sharman. I'm going to like read his last part. I think Trevor, like, we definitely need this like in the book. To sum up, there are good and bad things about being a minority. Sometimes I feel like I want to change my race, but then I think about my family and friends and decide I'm happy with who I am. Yeah, I love that.
So just to kind of round us off before I pass the time to Ethos for the book signing, I think brownness, something that hasn't been touched on, which I think has been hinted at, is not just a reclamation of the term, but also when you think of brown, right, and how the older generations used to use the word brown, it's usually in a way that's kind of derogatory, right? You're too brown already, you don't go out in the sun, that kind of thing. But by centering brown, right, in our usage of the concept, it's kind of reclaiming it as something that's positive. And for those who want to do further reading, there's this term negritude, which does something similar. It was from Black critical theory, I forget which decade, but it's basically taking the concept of blackness as something that used to be just seen as something negative, and by adding etude to it, it was like basically coming up with a new term, a neologism that was describing blackness as just a thing that is a quality of being, rather than something that should be looked down upon, right? So I think brownness does something similar, but of course this is something that would cause other people to be like, hey, we're importing from the West again. So thank you everyone for being here, and we look forward to hearing more from the rest of you on what you think about the book. And
thank you. Please give a round of applause for our speakers.